Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of JMJ Master Consultant Gill Kernick's debut book and podcast, Catastrophe and Systemic Change, Learning from the Grenfell Tower Fire and Other Disasters. We appreciate everyone taking time to join us today. My name is Stephanie Kimball, and I'm the Global Marketing Director at JMJ and moderator of today's panel. For today's discussion, we will start off with Gill sharing some background on her journey of writing the book and podcast. Following Gill, we will have our panelist discussion, and at the end of the hour, we will open it up for some Q&A. If at any time throughout the presentation you have a question, please just type it into the question box on your GoToWebinar toolbar, and we will do our best to get to it at the end. Now, let me do the honor of introducing the woman who has brought us all together today, Gill Kernick. For the last 10 years, Gill has worked at JMJ Associates, delivering change programs for large, complex organizations. She is passionate about developing leadership capability and culture and believes that the voice and knowledge of the front line are strategic cornerstones for the prevention of accidents. Now, in addition to launching her debut book and podcast, Catastrophe and Systemic Change, in 2020, Gill was publicly voted one of the top 25 most influential people in health and safety in the UK. She has been a guest on numerous podcasts, participates in panels, and author of several papers, and also hosts her own blog, the Grenfell Inquirer. Gill, thank you for bringing us all together today. I will now hand it off to you to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. So firstly, I just really appreciate people taking the time to be here this afternoon, especially in the UK. There's lots of other interesting events going on, including Dominic Cummings giving evidence around the pandemic. So I appreciate you being in this conversation. And when I was looking at the list of people that had registered, one of the things that struck me was the diversity, which is something I'm very passionate about and speak a lot about in the book. You know, apart from my family and friends, I have to say hi to my mom in South Africa because she made me promise that I'd say hi to my mom in South Africa. So the family and friends, you know, there's colleagues, there's clients, there's lawyers from the Grenfell Tower inquiry, there's other interested people involved in the cladding scandal. So I just want to say I absolutely appreciate you being here and love the diversity of the audience. What I'm going to do is speak for about 15 minutes and really do a whistle-stop tour of two things. One thing is my journey from actually 10 years ago when I joined JMJ to the book, and then also do a brief overview of the book. But really, I wanted this to be about a panel discussion versus all about the book, because really I want the book to create some different conversations in the world. There's a particular group of people that I do want to specifically welcome, and that is the Grenfell community. I'll try not to cry. And the North Kensington community. I deeply appreciate you being here. And I also do want to say, in a couple of slides' time, I'm going to show some images of Grenfell, nothing about the building on fire, but I'll show some images of Grenfell before and then immediately afterwards, so the husk of the building and how it is now. So if that could trigger you, then maybe turn off the video and pick up again when I talk about the book. So I just wanted to let people know that that was coming up. And what I'd like to start with, Chloe, I don't think I have control of the slides. So just give me a second for a technical hitch. Chloe.
And while Chloe's sorting that out, please everyone just remember to type in any questions you have throughout the conversation, and we'll get to them after the panelist discussion.
Right, sorry about this, but we have slides. Chloe, can you just let me know in chat or come off and just let me know it's fine, people won't mind, or move the slides on yourself?
Gill, I have given you access, so you should be able to move through them.
It's not working.
Okay, I will move them for you then.
Thanks. Alrighty, thank you. So if you move to the next one. And the next one. So I'd like to start with a moment of reflection. This is the acknowledgement and dedication of my book, which is to the 72 people who lost their lives in Grenfell. But I'd like also to think about all the other lost lives in catastrophes and have us be present to why it's important that we learn is because of the human impact. So I'm going to just keep quiet for a couple of seconds, and if people can just reflect on why it's important that we learn. Thanks, Chloe. And if you move to the next slide. And then if you could just do the next three. I apologize to people. I'm going to have to talk you through. Just do the memories. That's perfect. Just do them all. Okay, so in 2011, 10 years ago, I moved back to London and in fact started working for JMJ Associates, which is where my love of safety and preventing major accidents began. But moving back to London, we were looking for somewhere to stay, and a tower block, which was never somewhere I thought I'd stay, caught my eye, and we moved into an apartment on the 21st floor of Grenfell Tower. It still is one of the most beautiful places I've lived. The views were absolutely spectacular. And in fact, we so fell in love with high-rise living. In 2014, we moved to Trellick Tower, which is a nearby tower block. And the last picture under memories is the view that I had from 2014 to the 14th of June, 2017. A picture that reminded me of wonderful memories. And then on the 14th of June, we all know what happened. I sat on my bed and I watched Grenfell Tower burn. In the immediate aftermath, I actually met Matthew Price the day afterwards, and he interviewed me for the Today program. He was at that point working for the BBC. I remember a specific moment sitting on the balcony with him, thinking about Piper Alpha and promising that I would do whatever it took to learn, that I would somehow make those lives count. But the next phase I went through is what I would call closed doors and despair, because in the months afterwards, I learned about all the other failed opportunities to learn. The first picture under closed doors and despair is of a fire in 1999 in Garner Court, in which a person, Alexander Linton, was killed. There was a select committee hearing afterwards that found that the dangers of cladding was external fire spread that could re-enter a building. The following two pictures are of another fire 10 years later, the Lakanal House fire. The picture is of Catherine Hinkman. The compartmentation was breached within 4 minutes. 6 people died, and the recommendations were to review the stay put policy, the guidance called Approved Document B, and to change the advice that was given to residents in what are called fire survival calls, guidance calls. None of those recommendations made by Francis Kirkham, the coroner, were implemented prior to Grenfell. The final picture is the view that I had of Grenfell straight after the fire, the burnt husk of the building. So if I was committed to learning and all I was left with was despair, what could I do? And there were 3 significant things that happened. The first was with Jim Wetherbee, who again is joining us today, and Jim's a former NASA astronaut and very experienced and good person. And he, in the aftermath of the fire, I was very lucky to be mentored by him in terms of how on earth do you bring about change after something catastrophic. And one day, Jim said to me, The doors of all the people that should speak to you will be closed. Stop knocking on them and start looking for open doors. The second thing that happened is I met a wonderful woman by the name of Emma, who said to me, "You're not grieving." My response was, "I've got nothing to grieve about. I didn't live in the tower at the time. Nobody super close to me died." And I then spent 2 weeks crying and realized that no matter what, no matter how closely associated to it I was, there was grief for me. And I started therapy. And that made an enormous difference. The pictures that you see there, one is of Yassine Al-Wahabi, who is somebody that died on the floor, on my floor, on the 21st floor. And that's a picture of him that somebody created and was put in some of the makeshift memorials around the tower. And it's one of the places I used to go and cry. I used to take flowers and put them down there and walk past it. So there was a lot of space of healing. There were also on the 14th of every month until the pandemic, a silent march. And you see pictures there of the community walking in silence to honor those that died. So the third part really involved this grief, and then seed planting, which is where hope comes from. So I just started following open doors. And if I talk about some of the people on the call, so Matthew, on the basis of an interview that I did with Matthew for the BBC, I met somebody by the name of Martin Stanley, who's a former senior civil servant. He taught me all about how government works or should work and doesn't work. And through Martin, I met somebody by the name of Diane Coyle, who is the co-director of the Bennett Institute of Public Policy at Cambridge. We did a workshop together last year, bringing diverse people together to talk about policy lessons from catastrophic events. And Diane is also the editor of my book. So really, through the seed planting and the grief, I really found the hope. And where hope lies is in our communities, in how we work together, in following these strange, beautiful paths, and who knows where they lead. And in my case, it led to, and I actually got the copy today, it led to this book. And I'm going to turn now to speak a little bit about the book. Obviously, I'm not going to give you a detailed analysis in the time that we've got, but Chloe, if you can move to the next slide. So there was two significant shifts for me in the whole process. Firstly, when I was sitting with Matthew and watching the fire, I said I wanted to make sure we learned from Grenfell. But the more I discovered how much we don't learn, the previous failed opportunities to learn from Grenfell, which is common across catastrophes, I realized that there was a pre-question I had to delve into, which is why don't we learn? Because what's predictable is we'll identify lessons from Grenfell, but we'll fail to implement them and we'll fail to learn them. So the first shift was, what are the lessons from Grenfell to why don't we learn from catastrophes more generally? And then secondly, I started writing the book at the beginning of the pandemic. The title at that point was Grenfell and Systemic Change. But as I watched the pandemic unfold, I saw all the same issues. So it was all the same stuff happening over and over again. And today we are close to 3.5 million global deaths from the pandemic. So the shift was away from a sole focus on Grenfell. It's a core part of the book, but a sole focus on Grenfell to catastrophes in general. And Chloe, if you switch slides. So very briefly, this is an outline of the book. Part 1 looks at Grenfell in quite a lot of detail. The first chapter looks at what happened on the night. It's based on the evidence during phase 1 of the inquiry, both the expert evidence and the report. It's not technical. I'm not technical. So it's written hopefully in an accessible way. It's how I made sense of what happened that night. And then chapter 2 looks at before, during, and after. So what were the failed opportunities to learn? What do we know about what happened during the night, and specifically the fire brigade's response? That again is based largely on the evidence from the phase 1 inquiry. And then what about afterwards? And that looks at both the response in the community, so what happened to the survivors of the fire and the community in the immediate aftermath. It looks at the inquiry and what we know to date. So I'm very conscious I'm writing a book in the middle of an inquiry. So it looks at what we know from the inquiry through to nearly the end of module 2 in phase 2 for people that know what that means. And then it also looks at the broader issue of the building safety crisis. So Grenfell is not an isolated bad building. There's thousands of unsafe buildings and millions of people living in unsafe homes in the UK. So it looks at the government response to that. And then part 2, I will talk through in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to have Chloe stick up a recommendation that moved me deeply. And it's from Francis Kirkham, who was the Lakanal House coroner, who read an early version of the book. I'll let you read that. Great, Chloe, if we go to the next slide. Great, just put them all up, it's fine, rather than me telling you. So there's 3 lenses that I use to analyze it through, which is my biases, and I'm very transparent about them. The one is complexity, so I'm fascinated about the 4th Industrial Revolution, how our traditional ways of thinking and operating are becoming obsolete in a complex world. The second one is safety, and particularly my passion for low probability, high consequence events. And the third one is leadership. And again, the notions of traditional control, command, leadership are becoming obsolete in today's world. And then I look at this thing called systemic change, and I distinguish between systemic change and piecemeal change. So piecemeal change is changing part of the system. Systemic change involves understanding the conditions underlying and holding things in place. What's stopping things from changing? So piecemeal change could be, let's change all the materials or change all the fire doors or change all the cladding. For systemic change, you'd have to understand, why does it make sense that thousands of buildings have cladding on? What does that say about our regulatory regime? What does it say about procurement? What does it say about regulatory capture? So you'd have to look at a far, far broader perspective. And the book is focused really on what would it take to cause systemic change. And Chloe, if you go to the next slide. And I do it through a process of inquiry. And the main question I'm asking is, why does our failure to learn make sense? And then there's 2 questions I stick to, is why don't we learn? And how might we enable systemic change through these 4 lenses? So foundational looks at things like regulations, governance and accountability. Behavioral looks at things like the mechanisms in place for scrutiny and our response to events such as inquests and inquiries. Relational considers things like regulatory capture, the narratives we use to silence, etc., etc. And then contextual looks at things like culture. So what are the cultural things that contribute? And if we go to the next slide, Chloe. And then in each of the chapters that look at these things, I look at myths, known issues, lessons from Grenfell. What are conditions holding the status quo in place, and what are the opportunities to disrupt? So from a systemic change perspective, disruption is good. Change doesn't happen without disruption. The system's designed to maintain the status quo. So if you want change, you want something to disrupt it. And in each of them, I look at a disaster as a case study. In foundational, we go way back to 1666 and look at the Great Fire of London, which explores the myth that regulations keep us safe. And then we look at challenges with regulations, vulnerabilities with regulations. Lessons from Grenfell considers how so many buildings ended up with unsafe cladding. And then I consider that the condition holding the status quo in place is known failures in governance and weaknesses in governance, and the opportunities to disrupt is improving our ability to deal with complexity. So that's kind of the structure that each of the chapters takes. I won't go through all of them in as much detail, but behavioral looks at Boeing and looks at the myth that of the perfect error-free world. It looks at failures of scrutiny mechanisms. So the issues with cladding had been raised numerous times in the UK government and not responded to. So it looks at those kinds of issues. And then relational looks at the Costa Concordia, which is a ship that sank off the coast of Italy. It looks at things like regulatory capture, relationship issues within organizations, speaking truth to power, and lessons from Grenfell looks at the narratives we use to silence, as we've seen residents have been silenced. And then contextual looks at the Hillsborough disaster. Those are front pages of the Sun newspaper straight after the disaster. And then when the truth came out, it speaks about the fight for justice and how we can't have systemic change without really fundamentally challenging deeply held assumptions and beliefs. You can't simply change regulations. You have to begin to look at shifting how people think and what they believe. Lessons from Grenfell there looks at the effigy. So there was this, I won't really actually go into it, but looks at how we other people, how we can really frankly be quite nasty to other people. And it looks at how that contributes to disasters as well. And then Chloe, if you go to the final slide, I wanted to end on hope. The picture that those 4 chapters paints, it makes it really clear why we don't learn. In fact, if you look at it, you kind of go, okay, well, we'll never learn. We might as well give up. And I have gone through phases of feeling that way, but it was incredibly important to me to end on hope. And where I have found hope is in what I call the democratization of change. So if you look at the world today, and if you look at social media and our ability as communities to connect and be activists for change, that really is where hope lies. I thought I'd find it with governments and organizations. I didn't find it there, but I have found it in organizations such as Grenfell United or in our cladding scandal, who come together and force change. And I end the book with a quote, which is by a woman, an American writer by the name of Rebecca Solnit, who has studied post-disaster communities, and it completely captures the hope for me. But I can't read it without crying, so I asked Matthew to read it for me. And I'm going to end there. Is, you know, that's an outline of the book. So we've done the journey and a very, very high level outline of the book, and I'll let Matthew end with the quote.
Thank you, Jill. When all the ordinary divides and patterns are shattered, people step up to become their brother's keepers, and that purposefulness and connectedness brings joy, even amidst death, chaos, fear, and loss. We are building something immense together that, though invisible and immaterial, is a structure, one that we reside within. Though there are individual voices and people who got there first, these are collective projects that matter not when one person says something, but when a million integrated into how they see and act in the world. The we who inhabits those structures grows as what was once subversive or transgressive settles in as normal, as people outside the walls wake up one day inside them and forget they were ever anywhere else. The consequences of these transformations are perhaps most important where they are most subtle. They remake the world, and they do so mostly by the accretion of small gestures and statements and the embracing of new visions of what can be and should be. The unknown becomes known. the outcasts come inside. The strange becomes ordinary. You can see changes to the ideas about whose rights matter and what is reasonable and who should decide if you sit still enough and gather the evidence of transformations that happen by a million tiny steps before they result in a landmark legal decision or an election or some other shift that puts us in a place we've never been.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you for sharing that, Matthew. And Jill, thank you for sharing all that background on your journey with us today. Now we're going to transition into our panelist discussion. As you may have noticed, we have a few others joining Jill today. We have Jeff Williams, Matthew Price, and Jim Wetherbee. And before we get started, I'm going to introduce them all. So Jeff Williams is a CEO at JMJ Associates and brings over 20 years of extensive global consulting experience. He designs and executes innovative consulting results that bring people to the center of the solution through working with top-level executives in complex organizations looking for results beyond the predictable. He is passionate about digitalization and has authored dozens of articles and regularly speaks at events. Prior to becoming CEO at JMJ, Jeff served as a global consulting leader for EY's oil and gas practice while also leading the Americas energy consulting business. Next up, we have Matthew. Matthew Price is a journalist, presenter, moderator, and mentor with over 2 decades of experience covering some of the biggest stories of the last 20 years. He is currently with Sky News, leading a team of data journalists who are finding new ways of covering stories and presenting information to get the facts across to new and diverse audiences. And in addition, he co-created the Catastrophe podcast with Jill. His work takes him to a variety of debates, conferences worldwide, hosting and moderating discussions for various institutions and organizations, and has won multiple awards along the way. Our final panelist of the day is Jim Wetherbee. In Jim's over 20-year career, he flew 6 times in the space shuttle. In 1998, he was appointed as the Director of Flight Crew Operations, specifically selected to improve the flight and ground safety in the astronaut corps. Based on that success, Jim was selected after the Columbia accident to enhance the safety aspects in the organizational culture at the Johnson Space Center, home of NASA's Human Space Flight Program. With 35 years of experience in high-hazard operational environments, Jim consults with leaders and operators in dangerous endeavors with critical mission objectives. He is the only American astronaut to have commanded 5 missions in space and is the only person to have landed the space shuttle 5 times. Jim is passionate about helping leaders and operators perform successfully in hazardous environments and is the author of Controlling Risk in a Dangerous World. Thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to start this off with you, Jim. Jim, can you kick us off and speak to the comment of, if there was one piece of advice that you could give executives on preventing accidents, what would it be?
So thank you very much for having me. Jill, great book. I've read it and I look forward to reading it again. Too often, many executives, I believe, think there's a trade-off between safety and making money. And they don't really understand that if you work in high quality ways, you can do both. It turns out I've looked at many organizations that have had many accidents over the years, and there are always 10 adverse characteristics that are in place in an organization before it has a disaster. And so if I had one thing to mention to an executive, I would choose the number one reason, and that is that executives tend to, in many cases, incentivize results. But if we think about it, the people, the workers, the operators don't really create results, they conduct activities. And so if an executive would rather incentivize results, but rather help people with improving the quality of their individual activities, then they can be successful in their companies and their organizations.
Great. And Jeff, this kind of ties into a little bit with JMJ. So, many of our clients face these safety challenges that at times can seem overwhelming. And because they work in environments that are inherently hazardous, can you speak to how we can challenge, the sometimes long-held assumption that accept injury as a cost of doing business?
Yeah, thanks. And again, let me also give my congratulations to Jill on her book as well, and thank you to Jim and Max for being here. I'm in awe of all three of these individuals. So for us, it's about mindset and culture. Our clients understand that they work in high hazard environments, and most no longer want to live by the long held assumption that injury is just a cost of doing business. It is proven that safety performance can be exceptional, even in high hazard industries like the offshore oil and gas industry. And we've proven that lives can be saved by changing the mindset of people working in these industries. And where you have industries that maybe have not yet come to this perspective, we can show them a different way of thinking. Caring for your people is not just the right thing to do, which I think most people know, but it's also the smart thing to do. Lowering incidents and injuries can save money. It can save time. It produces happier workforces who generally tend to do better quality work, as Jim was saying. But they do need help in understanding how they can change these disruptive patterns. So, it's rarely the case these days that individuals within an organization or project would consider, someone being hurt or killed as an acceptable cost of doing business. So, and it doesn't matter if it's an employee or a contractor working on that employee's behalf. But what we find is it is often the case that trust between management or leadership and the workforce can be strained to the point where the workforce may perceive this to be true. And then so the collective actions, by leaders may show people that they are uncared for, even if that's not what the leader's intent is. And so changing this perception is part of our work at JMJ, both with leadership within companies, organizations, projects, wherever we're working, but most importantly, also with the frontline workforce. And a visible demonstration of care is often a powerful method for changing this perception. And as for the overwhelming part, which I do think is important, changing a safety culture is a huge undertaking, and it doesn't matter if it's something that you're just starting on or you have an intervention you need to make because something is not the way you want it to be. But yet when you break it down by each person doing their individual part in generating the whole, it does become a lot less daunting. And so what we at JMJ try to do, and what people like Jill try to do, is to help people through a process that create that new future and that future vision.
Thank you. Switching gears a little bit, Matthew, you have covered war zones, immigration crisis, and various stories across the world. Given all of your past experience, can you share more with us about, how is it different covering Grenfell that was essentially right in your backyard?
I'll just start not by offering congratulations to Jill on the book, but by saying hello to her mum in South Africa, because mum's still with us watching. Hello, mum. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question about the difference between covering something away from where you live and something that's literally in your own backyard. Because I live very close to the Grenfell Tower, not quite as close as Jill, but I live a 15-minute cycle ride away. When you go to a war zone or an earthquake or the scene of a disaster, there's a certain distance that you can put between yourself and the place that you're reporting from. And it's a geographical distance as well as a psychological distance. I remember flying back from the Haiti earthquake in 2010. 300,000 or so people died in the earthquake. And it was devastating, and it was a very emotional time covering that earthquake. I was living in New York at the time, and while I was traumatized in many ways and overloaded with emotion after the day's reporting there, the physical distance, the actual removing yourself from the scene and going somewhere very different really helps you to adjust. And Grenfell was the opposite. Now, my experience of Grenfell was nothing like any of those who lost loved ones, family members, friends in that fire. My experience was nothing like any of the firefighters who were involved in that, the emergency workers and others who were on the scene. And yet, from my perspective, the proximity of the disaster to me was overwhelming, because you couldn't, and this speaks to what Jill was saying about the grieving process, where she thought she had nothing to grieve for. Just because we haven't been directly affected by something doesn't mean that it hasn't affected us and that we haven't got something to process. So I said I live a short distance from Grenfell, 15-minute cycle ride away. The school that my daughters go to, they were commemorating what had happened at the school. There were children there who knew children who were in the tower or relatives of those children. So it did affect me in a different way. And I think also, just as a concluding remark, it's important, we're all in the midst of this pandemic at the moment. We're all being affected by it in so many ways. We all deal with existential questions every single day. Whether we switch off the news or we don't switch off the news, it's there in front of us all the time. And I think this sort of sense of shared grieving or shared empathy for those events which happen on our doorsteps is a really important one to explore.
I think, Stephanie, if I can just build on a couple of things, because one of the things that I've asked myself a lot about is, why was I so deeply impacted by Grenfell? Because I've been around a lot of disasters and somehow this was existential, and obviously I'd lived there. But the thing that I came to is it's because people died in their homes. So, you know, in a work context, or you know, it's a high hazard industry, and while we absolutely, it's unacceptable that anybody dies when they go to work, it's somehow like even worse that it somehow seems to be acceptable that people can die in their homes. That was something that really impacted me. That shouldn't be high hazard, but people stopped looking for vulnerabilities.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. And Jill, if you could kind of kick off the conversation, but I kind of want to go around with everyone and talk about what are the right conversations that need to happen on this topic. You know, how do we learn? What needs to be discussed? Can you kind of kickstart that, please?
Well, firstly, I don't know that I know what should be discussed, but I think what we should do is have inquiries, and specifically multidisciplinary inquiries. So the problems are complex. Yes, there's technical issues like, you know, changing cladding and fixing fire doors, and there's technical issues that should be dealt with. But in terms of how do you make sure that residents' voices are heard, or, you know, how do you make sure that there's collective grieving for a pandemic and that doesn't end up in a mass mental health crisis? I don't think we have the answers for those kinds of questions. And really, one of my big things is we just need to have different conversations and inquiries and bring people with different experiences and expertise together to come up with solutions we can't yet see. That's what I'd say to that.
Anyone else on this particular topic before we move forward?
You know, I think my reflection on this topic around conversations goes to the immense amount of data that may be available to us now, that in the, you know, even in the very recent past wasn't available, that you can use in order to help create the environment that you want to create. You know, we have the ability with technology and with some of the, you know, more recent advances with things like sentiment analysis and being able to gather, you know, people's thoughts and people's opinions about things. And we believe that you can utilize that in the work environment in a very positive way to then inform and adjust the things that you're looking to do around safety performance. So, you know, there are new vectors that are open now to those conversations, and, you know, and you can include things like diversity of thought and biases and other things in those data measurements and in those surveys and the other things that you can do to gather that data. But being able to look at those as a key indicator on your performance and your safety, but also potentially as a predictive indicator for where your culture is moving. There's some really interesting things going on around that space that we're looking at with our work, but I think that just in general in the world today is a really fascinating place to be.
And if I can jump in, just where Jeff talks there about diversity of thought and diversity of thinking, I want to go right back to when Jill and I first met each other after the fire, in those terrible, terrible days after the fire, when the streets around the tower were still full of people who were looking for loved ones who were missing, and people who were mourning, and people who were coming to help, and the amount of help that came in from the community. And one of the things that Gill told me in those early days, which utterly confused me, I had no idea what she was talking about. She said that regulations and rules do not keep us safe. And I don't know if you're now as confused as I was at that moment, but whenever she said that, I thought to myself, that doesn't make sense to me, because surely it was a lack of regulations or rules that led to that tower burning down. And of course, what I've come to realize, and I hope I paraphrase this right, Gill, is that actually, of course, we need regulations and rules. We need accepted methods of working and everything. But just because a regulation exists doesn't mean that we are safe. And just because a regulation tells us these are parameters in which we have to operate, that everybody in a building or in a high hazard industry will be okay, and their lives will be guaranteed. And to go back to the diversity of thought thing, I think it's really interesting to bring those two ideas together, because what I've learned in the years talking to Gill and making the podcast which accompanies the book that she's written, which is going to be put out in a couple of days' time, what I've learned is that actually a very single-minded approach, for instance, saying these regulations will keep everybody safe, is not going to work. Widen out your thinking, widen out the diversity of voices that you listen to, and widen out your diversity of approaches, and you will get to a much safer place. And I think that's where I've landed on this.
Yes, and I know that's a topic that you both speak to in the podcast. So we're going to be sending out the link to the podcast so everyone can kind of keep an eye on that and start to dive into those topics with you both. Staying on the topic of the podcast, I know we're all interested in listening to it, and I know that episode 5 is entitled Blame, and this kind of works into some of the topics that we've been discussing today, because we really tend to live in a culture of blaming, especially when it comes to politicians when something goes wrong. And of course, this doesn't help and can lead to an inability to be able to, admit to making these mistakes, and which leads to an inability to learn. How do we get out of this blame cycle? And maybe Matthew, if you could kind of start with this.
It's interesting because Gill mentioned that today in Britain we have this inquiry going on. Dominic Cummings, who was Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister's right-hand man, his chief advisor, has been sitting talking to MPs, pointing the finger of blame at every politician going, and to be fair, even himself to a certain extent, but there is a lot of blame being pushed around. Yeah, episode 5 of the podcast, we actually broaden it out. In the first 4, we look specifically not just at the Grenfell Tower fire, but also the Boeing MAX 737 airplane disasters, the Costa Concordia, the cruise ship that sank off the coast of Italy that Gill mentioned, and also we look at the pandemic and the response to the pandemic. But in 5, we broaden it out and we talk specifically about certainly the political culture here in Britain, and I think also, to be fair, in the United States and other countries around the world as well, where there is a culture of blame and therefore a culture of blame avoidance. And I think one of the things that really came through in that episode for me, and we talked to a former advisor to a government minister here in the UK and a political journalist and others. If you're in a culture where it's difficult to admit wrongdoing or to apologize, that stifles learning, because if you can't admit your own failures, how can you learn and therefore change things? And I think one of the lessons that comes out of that particular episode, and we do explore it elsewhere as well, is the role of the media in all of this. There's a sort of gotcha type of journalism that seeks to automatically pin the blame, to explain a terrible event away by demanding the resignation of a particular politician, and that there's some sort of feeling that the moment that politician steps down and leaves the scene, that suddenly everything is sorted out. And of course, nothing is further from the truth.
I think Jim will have something to say about this as well.
Jim, do you want to speak to this topic a little bit more, and maybe maybe answer the question of, you've had years of experience in high hazard and operational environments. Are accidents preventable? And, could you speak to that and the topic prior?
Okay, so I'll start with the topic prior. Yeah, unfortunately, we do live in a blame culture, blame society, but the way I try to think about it is blame is only part of the concept of accountability, and accountability, I think, is often misunderstood by almost every organization and every leader. People tend to think accountability is nothing more than a higher level responsibility. But if you think about the word, accountability comes from giving an account. And so if you have a boss who is exercising accountability in a proper sense, that boss will come to you periodically and ask good questions like, what did you and your team do last week? What did you learn last week? What's coming up next week? Do you have the sufficient resources? Have you been able to satisfy all the regulations and rules and policies and procedures? Do you have time? Do you have the resources to do that? What we want to see is bosses who are exercising accountability before the incident, not after the incident and finding who's to blame, but rather asking people good questions like, what went on last week? How can you prevent accidents next week? Those kinds of questions to hold people to account before the accident in a very good and positive way. To the question about, are all accidents preventable? I absolutely believe every accident in the history of the world is preventable. Unfortunately, there are two important caveats that sometimes result in tragic consequences. The first caveat is the victims themselves are not always the people in positions to prevent the accident. It's often somebody else in the organization or the structure that should have prevented the accident but didn't. And the second important caveat is the people who are able to prevent the accident don't often know how to prevent the accident. I was talking to a major company one time, and one of the senior executives asked me the question, how do we prevent all accidents, including unpredictable or seemingly unpreventable accidents, when we don't know where to look or what to look for? And I mentioned to her that unfortunately, sadly, this is the most important question if we're working in a dangerous business, is how do we do that? How do we know where to look? So the answer goes back to what Matthew was saying a little bit earlier in this podcast. Typically, think about what happens after an accident. An organization will do an analysis, they'll conduct investigations, they'll issue corrective actions, which are implemented, and then we fail to learn, as Gill mentioned, and that's why she wrote the book. But what happens is the organization promulgates rules-based procedures, and they are intended to help us prevent accidents that are similar to ones that we just had. But organizations keep having accidents, so we need something more than just the rules and the regulations. It turns out what we need, if we think about the difference between managing risk, is what the organization does, the managers do in the organization, where they promulgate rules, policies, and procedures. But think about it from the perspective of the operators and the workers. They actually control risk. And the way they do that is to follow rules, policies, and procedures, but they supplement the rules, policies, and procedures with something very important. And that something is what we call principles-based techniques of operating excellence. If organizations were following the rules, but also supplementing with principles-based techniques of operating excellence, now you have the ability to prevent all accidents, including ones that you're not predicting, because you're operating in a principles-based way, following the principles that have been created over years and years with people with experience who have had tragic accidents. And it's nothing more than the right way to do things. Yes, you follow the rules, but you're doing things in a high quality way, and the executives are helping the workforce to improve the quality of their activities and helping them follow the regulations recognizing that if we do this, we actually can be safe and can make money.
Thank you. Now, we've actually received a fair amount of questions, so I want to kind of switch gears and go into some of those because a lot of this ties into what we're discussing, of course. So one question we received was discussing the regulatory reforms of the 1990s and how they sought to redefine the norms for buildings in terms of performance goals. Although, kind of how you mentioned before, the regulations tend to define what we will accept, not what we want. And the building law reform seemed to have been focused on markets, not people. So is this an artifact of politics? And how do we reform regulatory process to make them responsive to those who live in buildings as opposed to those who design and build them? Big question there.
That's a big question there. If we knew the answer, then we wouldn't be in this conversation.
There is, Jill, isn't there? There's an interesting point in our episode 1 when we're talking to Guillermo Rain, who's a fire safety expert and engineer, and he talks about the growing complexity in terms of building design at the moment, be that because of fashion, because of the desire to have a particular front on a building or a particular design within the building, but he also talks about the need for sustainability as well, which is now coming in. If I sort of paraphrase his argument right, Jill, Guillermo's point was that with that growing complexity and with those growing, very fast moving changes in the world of architecture, the regulations just can't keep up, and there's a growing gap between the two. And certainly listening to Guillermo, Jill, in episode 1, he's pretty worried about that.
And just to bring Jim's point in about principle-based rules is that, I mean, my conclusion from the book is we just shouldn't rely on regulations to keep us safe. I'm not saying that there's not stuff that we shouldn't be doing to make regulations cleaner and clearer and more, more accessible, all of that stuff. But fundamentally, we shouldn't be relying on regulations to keep us safe. But there is some quite interesting, innovative stuff in regulations, for example, principle-based regulations or values-based regulations or regulations that favor people that do the right thing versus try and do shortcuts, etc., etc., etc. So I know that's not answering the question specifically, but I think we have to think differently about the role of regulations and how we interact with them if we're serious about preventing catastrophe.
Yeah, I think regulations, for the most part, are pretty good. Sometimes they get confusing, and there's a lot of them, and they're hard to comply with. But the bigger problem is once the regulation is promulgated, who is holding people to account to follow or comply with those regulations before the accident? Well, clearly it should be the company itself that's, for example, building a building. They should follow regulations. Well, the CEO of that company should be creating a process of accountability and ensuring that people down in his or her organization are complying with the rules, policy, and procedures in a principled way, as Jill mentions. And who's holding the CEO to account? Well, the board should be asking the CEO, how are you ensuring that your people are complying with the regulations that have been promulgated in a principled way? Don't just rely on the government agencies to enforce regulations that maybe they're creating. It should be the operators themselves who are being held to account or conducting a process of accountability to explain, here's how I am complying with the regulations that have been promulgated.
Thank you. And another question that came through, was kind of on the topic that it seems like we are, generally learning as a species, but we're having trouble dealing with and identifying what are the unknown unknowns. So can we develop a method to get people to get comfortable in looking at identifying what those unknowns are and hopefully eventually, making it avoiding catastrophe? And how can we get people to take seriously that we have these unknowns out there and that they need to be identified. And Jill and Jeff, I'm not sure if this is something that has come up with your conversation with clients, but could you speak a little bit to that?
I can speak. So in the book, there's this really interesting field of called post-normal science, which I talk about in the book, actually specifically in relationship to this this thing, because how do you identify the unidentifiable or the unknown? Now, in most accidents, they're actually not unknown unknowns. We just didn't heed the warnings that they were coming. So that's the first thing. So Grenfell was not an unknown unknown, and in fact, most catastrophes aren't. But I think as the world becomes more complex, what the post-normal scientists say is you have to include different ways of knowing. So our traditional kind of expert scientific view is insufficient to identify or collect or respond or understand the complexity that we face today. So they talk about the need to acknowledge different ways of knowing. We've seen this quite a bit with the pandemic, with the in the beginning days with the science or relying on the data, and then perhaps not including the knowing of the frontline workers into how we responded, etc., etc. So it just, given the time, I'd say including different ways of knowing and stop relying on traditional notions of expertise.
Thank you. And I know that we are getting short on time. And I do, before we sign off here, I really want to hand it over to you, Jill, to finish us off. And can you share with us what your overall hope is for the book and the podcast?
So frankly, to have conversations like this that hopefully lead to some different ways of thinking and some different actions. So the whole intent of the book, it's my perspective. The podcast adds a whole lot of other different perspectives, but the whole intention is to help us engage in some different inquiries in the hope that we can actually learn and make those lives count.
Thank you. And I know that we could go on and talk about this topic for double the time, but I want to be mindful of everyone's schedule. And I just want to thank everyone, all our panelists and everyone for joining us today. You know, we really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us for the launch of Jill's debut book and podcast. As you will see on the screen, if you'd like to learn more about the book or podcast, you can open your camera and point at the QR codes on the screens. But do not worry if you do not have your phone close by or are not tech savvy. We will be sending out a follow-up email that has the recording of the webinar along with a link to learn more about the book and podcast. And I know we didn't get to all the questions, but we will do our best to follow up with you if we can after the fact. But once again, you know, thank you to all our panelists for joining us today, and thank you everyone on the call. We're going to end here, so please have a safe and wonderful rest of your day, and keep an eye out for that email coming your way in the next few days with that information. And that's it, unless anyone has anything else to add.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.